are watching Channel Africa Conversations.
From the first time that AfriForum, Solidarity, and other Afrikaner leaders and some in the Democratic Alliance went to the USA, they went, for example, to say, watch our elections, it's going to be stolen. They went to say, whites are the victims of genocide. They went to say that our land is being confiscated, and they were all peddling lies to the US, but that has stuck, and they called for South Africa to be punished, for South Africa to be excluded from AGOA, from trade deals and all of those things, until they realized the very point that you had just made, that there will be thousands of black workers affected in the automotive factories, on the orange farms and in other factories, but that the owners of those factories are the very people on whose behalf they are going to petition for punishment.
Hello and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations. I'm your host, Peter Ndoro. Today on the global front, we look at a diplomatic storm that's brewing. This as the United States announced sanctions against South Africans, sending shockwaves through international relations and raising serious questions about sovereignty, justice and global power dynamics. I'm joined today by Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, the former South African ambassador to the United States, a seasoned voice on geopolitics, and we unpack the implications, the message behind the move, and what it means for South Africa's foreign policy. Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you again.
So it's been a few months since the United States says that you are a persona non grata, you are not allowed to take up your position as South Africa's ambassador to the US. With now time to reflect and events that have taken place since, and I'm thinking also now about Mcebisi Jonas recently, do you think that your expulsion was personal or was it part of a bigger story?
Look, I think that those who think it was just a personal indiscretion, I think is being proven wrong every day that passes. The fact of the matter is that the removal of the South African ambassador has not eased the relationship. It shows that that was only a deposit on the other punishments that were already to come and that before that were already in place. And so the fact is that this latest threat of sanctions against leaders of South Africa is what was promised at the moment that I was declared persona non grata. I was told that it was between sanctioning the leadership of South Africa or expelling the ambassador, and it was just an executive order to expel me, while sanctions would have to take a congressional and a senatorial path and would be longer. So they're now at the point where they are implementing the second part of that punishment, and so they're reaching for every spurious reason. But I think it is political, and it is about South Africa's place in the world, and it is about South Africa's animating role for a multipolar world.
All right, let me go back to Donald Trump, part one, the first time he was in the White House. What has happened since then? Because his attitude towards South Africa was very different to now. What's happened in between, and what is it about this current term that there seems to be this urgency and this determination almost to destroy this relationship between South Africa and the US?
I think the main difference between Donald Trump 101 and Donald Trump 201 is that Donald Trump 201 has a mission, and it's often a vengeful mission. It is often an urgency that this is his last term, and it is a mission that was fired up by particularly the social media platform and the financial platform that particularly ex-South Africans have been able to provide him. Those ex-South Africans are well known. It's Elon Musk and his social media platform that has been given to Donald Trump. It has been Peter Thiel and the whole PayPal and technological means. It is, for example, those who control Breitbart, the right-wing media newspaper, and those who have written the textbook on diversity as a myth. So those particular South Africans have entrenched themselves around Donald Trump, and they have particularly also offered him, for the supremacist project, a set of victims in South Africa, white Afrikaners, that Donald Trump has been parading in Washington, and on whose behalf he invited refugees from that community back to the United States. So I think that those are the critical matters that's different between Donald Trump 101 and Donald Trump 202.
So the question now then becomes, what is the US got to gain here? Most of the people, if I think about the exports, AGOA, most of the people that are affected by this are white farmers, for example. So black people, the ordinary black ANC following cadres, they're not directly affected in the same way economically as the white farmers that own vast tracts of land exporting goods to the US.
So from the first time that AfriForum, Solidarity, and other Afrikaner leaders, and some in the Democratic Alliance, went to the USA, they went, for example, to say, watch our elections, it's going to be stolen. They went to say whites are the victims of genocide. They went to say that our land is being confiscated, and they were all peddling lies to the US, but that has stuck, and they called for South Africa to be punished, for South Africa to be excluded from AGOA, from trade deals and all of those things, until they realized the very point that you had just made, that there will be thousands of black workers affected in the automotive factories, on the orange farms and in other factories, but that the owners of those factories are the very people on whose behalf they are going to petition for punishment. That is why their mission in February, March of 2025 was to say, no, 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 don't punish South Africa as a whole. What you must do is sanction the ANC leaders, put them under sanctions, freeze their assets, stop their access to the world. And therefore, what we are dealing with is not sanctions against South Africa. You are dealing with an attempt to identify which leaders of the ANC must be sanctioned, and they have been given a fig leaf to say, punish them because they're also corrupt. But at the end of the day, it is one that I think is aimed at particularly the ANC leadership. That's what I was told when I was there. And it is, for example, for the geopolitical positions that ANC policy has made South Africa take, like taking Israel to the ICJ, like neutrality in the Ukraine-Russia war, and like the expansion of BRICS to include countries like Iran.
All right. I mean, South Africa's foreign policy is not radically different from 20 years ago. Apart from Israel, where South Africa took the US to the ICJ, not much is different, really. So why is there a panic now when South Africa's position has been clear for decades?
I think more than 20 years ago, you had a forthright presidency. One, for example, in the words of Nelson Mandela, that said, don't you try to choose our friends and our enemies when you were our enemies during apartheid. I think now we have so many interests with the United States that we're speaking a lot more of a cautious language to protect those kind of interests, but it hasn't stopped South Africa from advancing its values. So you're right, there's no major difference, except that suddenly in a period, in a context in which the United States, whether it was with Biden or whether it was with Trump, in which the United States has weaponized the dollar, has used the dollar and the integration into the US financial system to punish any country that they want to, any company that they want to, any leaders that they want to. The world is waking up and saying, we cannot be subjected to this pernicious regime in the United States. And so what the world is beginning, and South Africa finds itself in the eye of the storm almost, because South Africa is at the heart of BRICS. We convened the BRICS meeting that for the first time raised, but it was rejected, the idea of de-dollarization. South Africa is at the head of efforts to find a genuine peace between Ukraine and Russia, and the US thinks that that should be its sole domain, and South Africa has had the temerity and audacity to take Israel, the first country that has done it, to take Israel to the International Court of Justice, charge it with a genocide, and then get a prima facie case, won with almost all the judges in that ICJ. And that, I think, has shaken up the United States, that South Africa is part, now that it's also the G20 president, is part of a geopolitical realignment in which multipolarity may result in multilateralism, in which the rest of the world can stand up to being bullied.
The British Prime Minister, I think, is finding out pretty quickly that the position that they had held with regards to Israel is not popular at home. I suspect that that's starting to become the case in the United States as well. What will that then do about the US's stance against South Africa over Israel?
So you see, Peter, it's not an accident that we charge Israel with genocide and the US charges the ANC and South Africa with genocide against white farmers. We charge Israel with occupying Palestinian land. The US and Trump charges South Africa with confiscating white land. It is an attempt at creating a false equivalence between the wrongs we do with the wrongs Israel does. And so what is mostly feared is the fact that when South Africa had the courage to take Israel to the International Court of Justice, suddenly it had a mobilizing effect on the citizens of the world. In the United States, it turned the campus against the Capitol. In Europe, it turned the streets against their leaders. It created mass marches. It even had the effect of having young Jewish leaders and citizens and Jews across the diaspora saying, not in my name, I cannot. My great-grandfather did not die at Auschwitz for me to give them a blank check to do this kind of work and this kind of starvation and genocide against the Palestinians. So South Africa, in that case, despite all our problems, our decade of corruption, despite all of that, South Africa remains a moral superpower, and South Africa, because of its historical apartheid situation, has a constituency across Europe and North America with people who supported us, boycotted for us, had sanctions for us, and so forth. And so those are the people that South Africa speaks to, and that's the fear that sits in the heart of Trump and why he needs, A, to create a moral false equivalence with South Africa, and B, to punish South Africa. But as you pointed out, France, the Netherlands, Britain, and other countries across Europe and across the world are increasingly beginning to see that South Africa was right almost 2 years ago when it took Israel to the ICJ and charged it with genocide, because that is now becoming absolutely apparent.
They say often there are unplanned for consequences to certain actions that you take. The US might be going through a certain path. I wonder if this isn't a moment for the continent. I see Donald Trump had 5 West African leaders in the White House the other week. Is he on a mission to divide and conquer Africa so that Africa doesn't mobilize together to fight the US? Because as a collective, we probably have a lot more fight against the US than as individuals.
I think that's exactly the fear, that South Africa is central to the African Union, to BRICS, to the G20, to the non-aligned movement, and has the kind of moral conscience that can do things for our values and sometimes even at the expense of our interests, as is the case now. And so Africa particularly needs to stand together, and there's no accident that this vengeance against South Africa happened, especially after we sacrificed 18 soldiers in the eastern DRC against proxy forces for the United States. And the presidents that Donald Trump is inviting are those that he believes will sign over their critical mineral rights and their rare earth element rights to the United States. And that is why even in the tariffs that he's imposing on South Africa, he excludes the manganese, he excludes the platinum in order to pick and choose what he wants. So if I can add to what you're saying, it's divide and conquer and extract. That is what the United States is trying to extract, the critical minerals of the world, because it has fallen way behind China in the battle for the fourth industrial revolution. It has fallen behind China in the processing of critical minerals that fourth industrial revolution requires, and it even has fallen behind in the way in which the supply chains of all of those have flowed towards the east rather than towards the west.
Help us understand what might be happening behind the scenes. We spoke about Trump 101 and Trump 2.0. He's only got another 3.5 years in office. Is it what he can do in this period of time so extreme and so disruptive that a reset might become very difficult post-Trump?
I think that the Democrats find themselves possibly in the weakest position ever. Some polls even suggest that their approval ratings are at 19%, and so they have a monumental task to get right in 3.5 years what they could not get right since the Obama years. They even find that Joe Biden had been complicit in the very things that we are now accusing Donald Trump of, and that's the genocide in Gaza and Palestine. And so the Democrats don't come in as the moral saviors of the United States. However, the plan always for these 4 South Africans that are entrenched in US politics has always been the post-Trump years. And that is why they put all their money on Vice President J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance may not be a blunderbuss like Donald Trump is, but Donald Trump is going to bludgeon the world into submission, and J.D. Vance is then expected to finish the work if those South Africans have their way and make him the presumptive candidate for the post-Trump years. And that may be a bit of relief from the blunderbuss approach and the bullying approach that we have had, but it may even be more dangerous for the world, given the fact that J.D. Vance already in his first 6 months as vice president has been more active than many other vice presidents that I've seen in the USA, but that J.D. Vance is laser focused. He is purpose driven. He has an agenda, and he is probably going to play to the tune of these South Africans. And so maybe we'll get a little bit of relief, but certainly I think that it will not stop this MAGA movement. It will not stop this America First movement. It will not stop America trying to regain dominance in the world. Not that it is not dominant, but it has ceded quite a lot to other multipolar entities.
South Africa has powerful friends. I mean, China is a mighty, mighty country and can stand face to face with the US. Russia is not a small entity. Surely there must be something about that friendship that South Africa can hold on to. We have BRICS, but it seems as if at this time it says the right things. Does it have the might to fight the US?
I think that The critical thing is not how powerful those countries are, how large they are, how large their economies are. It is in the issue of disposable capital. The US, out of 350 million people, probably have a middle class of 320 million people, meaning that its disposable capacity is far greater because its poverty levels are far less. Whereas China has a backlog of having to pull 500 million people out of poverty, India, much the same thing, Russia certainly is, because we are countries of the global south with large heritages of inequality and underdevelopment. And so a lot of our disposable capital has to go to the services of our own people before we can think of solving the problems of health in South Africa, PEPFAR money for South Africa, just energy transition money for South Africa. And so to a large extent, that's the critical difference, that they don't invest in the kind of military capacity that the US invests in. We invest just to remain survivalist and on par, but we can never exceed in R&D, and we can never exceed in the production of weaponry that can take on the USA. And that is why BRICS has the right intentions, but it does not have the wherewithal to follow that up as a counterbalance. And that's the difference between South Africa being at the heart of a multipolar world, but not yet a multilateral world, because in multilateralism, you have a greater capacity to act against perceived enemies rather than is the case when you are simply building a multipolar world, as South Africa is at the heart of.
You've spoken about how the global power struggle nowadays is more, it's less about oil and more about minerals. And those minerals are on the continent. And is there no way that we can use that resource to fight back?
I must say that in my exit report to the president after returning from the USA, I gave the president a set of scenarios on how to deal with the USA. I said that the ideal scenario, because we cannot retaliate against the USA for the reasons that I've said, and we cannot also surrender to the USA because we have certain values that are dear to us. And therefore, we must find a scenario between mutuality, where we have mutual interest with the USA, and contingency, in which we don't put all our eggs into the US basket. But for that scenario to realize, we need to know what are our leverages. I've spoken about our multipolar leverages that we have. So that's absolutely critical, how we animate Africa, how we utilize and build interdependence in BRICS and the G20 and so forth. But I think that, for example, critical minerals and rare earth minerals, Africa has 30% of the critical minerals that the world requires for this phase of economic development. South Africa has 80% of the platinum critical minerals, and no car can drive without platinum. When we realize collectively, as BRICS, as the global south, as Africa, what it is that the US wants from us, we will never allow 5 presidents to go and sign away the critical minerals of the DRC to Donald Trump. We will say, let us understand how we can utilize those minerals as our leverages against the trade war that the US is prosecuting across the world. Now, I think we haven't reached that stage of sophistication yet in understanding our leverages, in understanding the scenarios we need to unfold that's best for Africa, for South Africa and the global south. And we have not used our multilateral platforms sufficiently to make those cases to the USA and to say, listen, let us do a deal. On this, if you want our platinum, then we are going to need this. We cannot succumb simply to the idea that Trump says 30% tariffs on everything, but I will take your manganese and I will take your platinum without tariffs, because all he's doing is he's expropriating rather than investing in our capacities.
Where does the G20 sit in all of this? South Africa is leading the G20 this year. um, they must also be watching things that are playing out, maybe not particularly against South Africa, but the US in general and the positions that it's taken, even against countries like Canada. Where does the G20 sit? And we're now hearing that Trump might not even show up for the summit this year. It's almost as if he doesn't take the G20 seriously. Should the G20 find a position that's common to deal with Donald Trump's US?
I think by the time the G20 convenes in November this year, by that time, every country would have felt the pernicious effects of Donald Trump. The EU has been negotiating, the UK has been negotiating, everyone, China, everyone has been negotiating, and some of them have been tougher than others in their negotiations. And I think that the G20 has not yet discovered the power of the collective negotiations and leveraging against the USA. Everyone is still thinking that they can carve out a preferential deal for themselves, and so they don't want to be seen with others yet. However, I think by the time November comes, and especially if the US continues its boycott posture, that may be the case, in which the G20 would probably have to say, as the finance ministers have said, we've got to reform the WTO to get back to a rules-based trade regime so that we are not perniciously and driven in an ad hoc way towards trade deals that violate the very principles of fairness and equity and reciprocation that we are speaking about. And so I think already we can see warmth from European countries in the G20. I think we've got to turn that warmth into solidarity, and that solidarity into a unified response to the trade war, because everyone who thinks individually that they can run for cover are being proven wrong. That South Africa is just the most extreme victim of the USA because of supremacist ideological reasons, but no other country will be immune to that kind of perniciousness.
Where does one even begin? So, August 1, what do you think is going to happen? We've seen Donald Trump shout from the hills, threaten XYZ, and then 5 minutes before, he postpones or suspends or delays. Is he going to pull the trigger on these tariffs on the 1st of August?
You see, Peter, it is not the tariffs itself, it is the uncertainty. And so whether he changes his mind at the last moment, those are minor reprieves. For example, orange farmers in the Western Cape and Northern Cape have to decide what to do with their harvests, because effectively AGOA is gone. The African Growth and Opportunities Act have been hollowed out because the 30% tariffs is a violation of the tariff-free regime of AGOA. And so those farmers have to make decisions now already about how they harvest their oranges, what they do with their workers, whether they close the farms, because the shops in the US that used to buy the oranges and the orange juice factories that used to buy the oranges have not been able to secure the fact that they will be supplied, and at what price will they be supplied, and will it be on time, and therefore it may have to make other options in the USA, which means that we may sit with harvests that can't be sent. The same thing is happening with, for example, Mercedes-Benz. It already started to lay off workers. In the extreme case, for example, are the clothing factories in Lesotho. They've placed Lesotho under a state of emergency because of the uncertainty. They've already have empty factories in Lesotho because the orders are not coming in because of the uncertainty. So, you see, we mustn't treat Donald Trump as the benign person who at the last moment may change his mind. It is the uncertainty that he creates in the world, the fact of a trade war that he creates in the world, that I think is the end of AGOA and is, whether tariffs are entered or not, makes trade impossible.
All right, I want to end where we started, and it's this relationship, South Africa-US. At the moment, we describe it as the relationship between South Africa and the US. How close are we to South Africa versus the US?
I think that once we start losing automotive workers from the factories, farm workers from the farms, and so forth, I think that, and we've already lost all the HIV/AIDS money from the US, the research money, the energy transition money from the US. I think we are in a low intensity situation of versus the US. It's an undeclared conflict that we are dealing with. However, I think that we need to get to the contingency very quickly. Other markets and other forces in a multipolar world, that's going to be absolutely critical. I think that what South Africa needs to consider is that if we are punished, for example, for land confiscation, and we've lost all our aid money and we've lost trade, should we not speed up land reform in order to see whether those who are the victims of this fallout don't find a prospect in some peasant farming if we deal with it correctly? Those who are declared refugees, is there not a way that their assets must be appropriated for the fallout for the very poor in our society, especially those 50 who went over to the US already and who retain their properties here in South Africa? We need to be able to open up those kind of debates, because I think our people will suffer more, and we need to offer them some survival tactic in the meantime.
Ambassador Rasool, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so, so much indeed for joining us on Channel Africa Conversations and giving us such a clear picture of this strained relationship between South Africa and the US. But I think that there definitely is a much bigger picture and agenda playing out the rest of the world as well. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
And that's Channel Africa Conversations for this week. We were speaking to Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, the former South African ambassador to the United States, who was expelled by the US earlier this year. And he says that this is part of a bigger agenda, and that there are 4 significant South African people who perhaps have a lot more control and interest in what's happening in the White House right now that's playing out at the moment. Now, before I go, a reminder that we really do want to hear from you. We'd like to know what you think about what you've just seen, and also the kinds of conversations you'd like us to continue to have in the future, and who with. We look forward to your thoughts, and you can start by commenting in the comment section below right now. Until the next time, from me and the team, take care. Bye-bye.